What's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and today I want to talk to you all a bit about Warlock, Double Legendaries, and Covenant tuning. Now, we've already talked a lot about like double legendary combinations, which ones are the best, with one Covenant Legendary, one non-Covenant Legendary, but something that I think needs to be brought up, which hasn't really been, is how subpar our Covenant Legendaries actually are. Now, when Double Legendaries were first announced, my hope was that we'd have two of any legendary, meaning like Cinders and Madness, or Wilfrids and Grim Inquisitors. And that really opens up a lot of different playstyles, talents, combinations, all of that. My hope was that we really wouldn't have one Covenant and one non-Covenant, but that's sort of just where we landed. I think Blizzard did mention that they might have looked at maybe making it two of any kind based on feedback, but for the most part, people were disappointed in it for a day or two, and that just sort of, went away. So with that being said, there is like, a link to some sims going around that have shown some classes gaining a crazy amount of power with their double legendaries, and some classes not gaining very much, like Warlock, barring one Covenant and one Spec, but we're probably not even going to play it in the first place. So I want to talk today, number one, about how bad our second legendaries are, and then talk a bit about Covenant tuning, because we're going to look at sims for every Covenant, for every Spec, with 0-piece, 2-piece, 4-piece tier, and double legendary 4-piece tier. And there's a pretty good bit of disparity between the Covenants. So with that being said, any weak auras, profiles, or add-ons you see here, all for free on my Twitch. Swing by, hang out, ask any questions anytime. Feel free to do so. Also, one huge shout out to my patrons. Thank you guys for all support. Really appreciate it. Thank you. The 9.2 Warlock spreadsheet is indeed now live. Once again, the tier 3 Fatal Guard rank from a Patreon or higher does indeed get early access to that. If you're looking at supporting, it should be a link somewhere, I think maybe up here, as well as down in the video description below. So with that being said, let's just jump right into it, starting off with, let's just get into it. And yeah. Starting off with Demonology, this is our best single target spec that we have going in the 9.2. I will have all the sims, all the links to the sims down in the actual video comment section. If I forget to put them there, put a comment, I'll put it up, I'll pin it, I'll get it to you. So this is starting off with Night Phase sims. Now each sim is going to say like NF, for example, right here, Necro, Unity. Unity is the universal legendary on the belt that we're playing, Venthyr, and Kyrian. So these are sims for all four Covenants, playing your 0-piece of tier, your 2-piece, your 4-piece, and your 4-piece with double legendaries, right? This is just one. Now the legendary will also be indicated here in every setting. We only played what is supposed to be the optimal legendary for each spec. I'm not going to run 8 quadrillion different sims with different legendaries. I don't have that time. So we know what's good and what's bad for the most part, right? So getting into number one here, we have Night Fae 4-piece Unity at 11,815 DPS. Raw relative gain about 11% for the 2-piece, 4% or 4-piece being about 22% for Demonology, and the double legendary being about a 3% DPS gain in single target, which equates to about what, a 350-ish DPS gain. Not a crazy amount. This is Night Phase, so once again, like in 2-target and 3-target and 4-target, DSS will gain a lot of value because of the multiplicative haste stacking and the additive crit, right? But when it comes to double legendaries, putting on a second legendary and getting a 3% DPS gain, it doesn't really feel as impactful as it could be, and or should be, at least in my opinion, right? 11,815 DPS as like the high, like this is spoilers ahead, the highest sim we have for any Covenant. Moving on to Necro Lord, 11,787, which is pretty close to Night Fae, within, for 30-40-ish DPS, give or take. Looking at the overall DPS gain, same here, 2-piece, 4-piece, about a 4% DPS gain, putting on the actual Necro Lord Legendary, which, once again, I mean, there's no... Night Fae has scaling when it comes to 2-target, 3-target, 4-target. Necro Lord is basically single target based, and for being a single target focused legendary with also Demonology having so many stacking traits with potential power siphon, gameplay, sack souls, all that stuff, which is not even good here in the first place, right? And that, without having any kind of relevant, AoE implications with gaining more DPS and more targets, it just seems and sort of feels pretty subpar, only being a 4% DPS increase. Necro Lord, for the most part, has pretty much been neck and neck with Night Fae for the most part, as far as like sims have been concerned, mainly due to Kevin's Oozling being buffed with Plague Divisor in 9.1. And for the most part, that's carried over into 9.2. So even if they were even for the most part, I would still look at actually playing Night Fae over it due to number one, soul shape, and number two, in heavy AoE based settings, you get a lot of value out of having the multiplicative haste stacking from Decaying Soul Satchel and the additive crit in 2 or 3, 4 target cleave settings, right? So Venthyr, about 10,993 DPS with a whopping 1.7 DPS gain from the legendary. And that's because the Venthyr legendary is pretty much just, well, I mean, more or less AoE based. It doesn't actually show it doesn't show the actual ability here, but we'll pull it up at some point. I can probably scroll down here and look at it. But the big thing is that there really isn't any kind of single target implications with the Venthyr legendary. It's basically, hey, I'm going to cast Impending Catastrophe on cooldown, and it increases the baseline amount of Impending Catastrophe's damage, right? I think by 125. But it also has this stacking clause that for each target it hits, it gains a 15%, damage increase. I think it's capped at 275 now, I believe, on PTR. But the thing is, in single targets, and in most settings, you're not going to be hitting 8, 9, 10 mobs. On top of the fact that Impending Catastrophe is just not very good in the first place, and Venthyr is pretty undertuned, Venthyr falls pretty far behind by about 1,000 DPS compared to Night Fae, and about the same compared to actual Necrolord. And whether it's like an AoE, here's my concern with double legendaries for certain classes. Whether it's like a legendary that's mostly based around like heavy AoE settings, like the Impending Catastrophe legendary for Venthyr, or a legendary like Decimating Bolt for Necrolord, which is Shard of Annihilation, right? There's no real like middle ground there. This is like heavy AoE. They could theoretically buff the actual Venthyr legendary by a tremendous amount, making it a 400% baseline increase when it comes to or when it comes to the ability, and have a stacking damage effect on it. But then it scales to a crazy amount in AoE, and there's no real middle ground there, right? When it comes to a decent bit of fights in the raid, you're looking for a strong single target profile. I'm not looking for some massive chaotic AoE based profile. There are classes in the game and specs in the game that are much better than Venthyr Demonology at doing damage faster on a higher scale. Windwalker Monk, Survival Hunter, even after the nerfs. So it's a bit awkward seeing our second legendary be a whopping 1.7% DPS increase. And moving on to Kyrian here, we have a whopping 2.3% increase, coming in ahead of Venthyr at 11,289, but not as good as Necrolord or Night Fae. Now, like I said, I could run AoE sims here for the most. I could, but we know what's good in AoE and what's bad in AoE. And unfortunately, like for the most part, this has really been the difference between all the covenants for the majority of the expansion, right? But now we're having the legendary effects added on to the actual subpar covenant abilities, and it's sort of making for this odd scenario of like a lot of our legendaries just not being very strong when it comes to like double legendary things. I've sort of joked around about Warlock, and THE has as well, about Warlock getting better because all the classes are getting nerfed, and Lock's not. And to a similar extent, double legendaries won't come into week 5, so that also makes Warlock better, because from what I've seen, Lock is like one of the lowest classes, like one of the worst classes when it comes to gaining value from double legendaries. But hey, if you're in a high-end setting and the race is done by week 5 for you, well, doesn't really matter at that point. But if you're rating past that, in which 99.9% of the population will be, it feels pretty bad when someone else has a 1,000 DPS increase. I'm looking at what is it? A whopping, 250 DPS. So, moving on to Destro here. Same thing. We're going to have Night Fae, Necrolord, Venthyr, all that stuff. 10,240 looking at Destro. About the 2-piece is not a massive gain. It's relatively small, but the 4-piece is where most of the value comes from in Destro. It's about a 20% DPS gain with the consistency behind it, with Wilfrids, with Random Chaos. And you can see it's about a 3.5, right? Roughly, yeah, 3% DPS gain playing Night Fae, but once again in the 2-target, 3-target scaling settings, which, to be fair, Destro is played in a decent bit of the time if it's good enough because of like Havoc, Cleave, and things like that. It does gain more value than this. Moving on to Necrolord, though, keep in mind this is a single target. Necrolord being 10,220, which is very interesting because Necrolord, for the most part, has been a tiny bit ahead when it comes to Destro stuff up until pretty much this point in this sim. It comes in with a whopping 420 DPS increase at about 4.3%, which is pretty interesting. It's behind by about 140-ish DPS here, give or take. Once again, both being in single target. Necrolord, from what I had seen with one legendary, does gain more value in 2-target cleave, but when it comes to 2-target stuff with 2 legendaries, Night Fae just starts to leave it behind again because of Decaying Soul Satchel. But the big thing being, we're looking at what? About a 300 DPS increase here, give or take. Actually, exactly 300. A bit more here with Necro Lord, but a lower overall with your 4-piece on, about 420. And when it comes to Venthyr and Kyrian, yeah, like Kyrian, not actually as bad as it might seem at 10,000, basically 1,100 here. But Kyrian has the crit amp whenever you're casting Scouring Tides. And to be fair, there are some tricks you can do with Kyrian things, coming in at a whopping 487 DPS gain, but the actual value, or I guess the overall damage of the spec itself is just low at basically 9.6, and Venthyr also being at 9.3. Venthyr needs buffs, by the way, if you get something caught on. It doesn't get any better for Affliction. Spoilers ahead. So a bit more of a DPS gain for Destro than is Demonology here, coming in at about, what, 3% here, 4.2% here, 4.3, I'm sorry, 3.5% here for Venthyr, and a whopping 5.1 for Kyrian, but crit effect it's active for a good portion of the time, basically every 25-ish seconds, being 15% crit, I believe, in Destro, Chaos Bolt scaling. It sort of makes sense. But as you can see here, if you're looking for just straight up Covenant sims, Night Fae is still a tiny bit ahead of Necro Lord, and that's putting aside the Soul Shape relevancy, which also is, you know, well, pretty relevant. Moving on to Affliction stuff. So now, if you've seen the sims from 4P, like from 4-piece and Double Legendary sims for Night Fae versus Necro Lord, this is like the one spec and the one Covenant in the one spec where you actually gain a lot of value from playing the Covenant Legendary. Now, I'm not saying every single spec should be like what Necro Lord looks like here, but the disparity between this one Covenant Legendary and like just this version of AF compared to every other spec we're looking at here is pretty wild. So 10,271 DPS for the single target Malefic Wrath sim playing Night Fae. We'll come to this one last because I know it's pretty big. 10,271 for Night Fae. By the way, here's Venthyr. We're looking at a literally a 1,000 DPS loss just because Venthyr. 9,223. The raw DPS gain being about 3.8%. For Night Fae also it's about 3%, give or take. So not a crazy amount. Nowhere near as powerful as some other classes are. And looking at Kyrian, we coming in at 9,970, basically 10k, looking at, you know, about 300 less DPS than Night Fae, and roughly a 4.1% DPS gain. But when it comes to Necro Lord, with the Decimating Bolt, Withering Bolt, Drain Soul, Shard of Annihilation, everything, Execute stacking, Night Fae 10,271, Necro Lord 11,271, just a straight up flat 1,000 DPS gain, with their legendary being their second legendary being a 14.5% DPS increase in single target. Now the downside to this is that when it comes to 2 targets and things, it drops off considerably because the 4-piece buffs Drain Soul. It doesn't buff, you know, some kind of AoE based ability, versus once again Night Fae gaining value in 2 target, 3 target, 4 target scaling. And Night Fae will indeed pull ahead of Necro Lord when it comes to those settings, right? But this is like the one legendary combination out of all the Warlock specs playing good legendaries and good Covenants and all that stuff, right, where it is a substantial DPS gain. And if you go into the actual like HTML report here and the actual like overall sim and stuff or whatever, you'll see like the biggest spike in damage here is in the actual execute window, peaking at like 27.3 basically, give or take. Going into the actual Night Fae one, you'll see it doesn't peak as high, but it has a bit of a higher overall sustained DPS. The highest peak here in execute, I guess, sort of around there is 24k, give or take. It has a higher burst on pull compared to Necro Lord being smaller, but heavier in execute here. With Night Fae being a bit more consistent across the board, though, with your, you know, random rapture windows here and there, this and that. If you need that heavy execute on a fight at some point in Sepulchre, Necro Lord could potentially be the play. But at the same time, you're losing Soul Shape, and honestly, there are still other classes that are positioned better than Affliction when it comes to even that damage at the end of a fight, because they do more damage, and Affliction's single target is drastically undertuned, just like Destruction. So, like I said, I don't have the math when it comes to every single class and their 2-piece and 4-piece combinations here. I can show the actual sheet in a second here that looks at, like, you know, classes pre-Double Legendaries, post-Double Legendaries, all that kind of stuff, and we can run some math on it briefly, but I think this is partially a legendary problem and partially also a Covenant problem. So let's talk a little bit about that, and I guess some potential changes that could hopefully come and maybe address some of these issues. So getting into the covenants here, as we mentioned, Night Fae is pretty much the best covenant across the board, unless you're playing the weird execute build of Affliction with Necrolord and Malefic Wrath and Shard of Annihilation and all that stuff, right? So for the most part, we're going to use Night Fae as like the general best reference point when it comes to covenants. Now, there's more to that, obviously. There's a covenant-based conduit that affects every ability here, which I'm not going to go over. There are soulbinds. Yes, Night Fae soulbinds are good. Dreamweaver's Haste Amp is good. It plays well with the legendary, being Decaying Soul Satchel, because Dreamweaver gives, hey, X amount of haste with the Field of Blossoms, right? That haste is multiplicative, and it also gives you crit at the same time whenever you cast your Soul Rot. So it works very well. But even putting aside the synergies, I think there's some pretty big issues with the actual like covenants besides Night Fae. Now, in early 9.0, they added, it might have even been beta, they added a clause onto Soul Rot that it says withers away life forces of up to 4 enemies, however you word it. And then they actually added a clause onto it. Yeah, like your main target, your primary target takes basically twice the amount of damage as your secondary targets take, which might not seem like a crazy amount, but it does add up in the end. It gave Soul Rot and Night Fae that priority-based focus kind of damage, while also still keeping in the element of Cleave with, you know, Decaying Soul Satchel and the Drain Life cast, which to be fair, we really don't cast at all, barring one fight maybe coming up in the raid. But they were tuning the ability and made it a bit more single target based, while also keeping some of the AoE applications implications with the ability. Decimating Bolt, it affects different things for each spec. Demonology is Demon Bolt, Destruction is Incinerate, and Affliction is Shadow Bolt or Drain Soul, depending what talent you're playing. But these are all single target abilities. Yes, you can havoc some spells with destruction. I understand that. I get it. But they're all single target based abilities. They really don't have any kind of AoE scaling, right? Now, I'm not saying every covenant needs to be best across the board. Some things can be good at you know, niche scenarios and things like that. That's fine, right? And for the most part, I'm okay with Necrolord being basically like a de facto generic, like single target based covenant. I don't really have anything bad to say about Decimating Bolt, right? What it does, it's pretty good at. You've seen pretty big PvP builds with Demonology, one-shotting people with Demon Bolts with stacking Decimating Bolt effects. The Drain Soul build looks good for AF. And Destruction, well, I mean, it needs buffs. When it comes to Venthyr, though, and Venthyr is like the most underperforming covenant for Warlocks, basically the entire expansion, and in these sims as well, by a considerable amount. Keep in mind, Venthyr is literally, where's Venthyr at again? It is 9,223. Necrolord is ahead by over 2,000 DPS when it comes to the second legendary sim. There really isn't any kind of like single target bonus when it comes to impending catastrophe. It does the same amount of damage whether it hit the baseline ability, right? Whether it hits one target or 1 million targets. It doesn't matter how many it hits, it'll apply the same dot, it'll apply a curse, and it goes from there. Now, the actual legendary changes that a bit, right? It makes it so that it gets a baseline damage increase, which is 125, which is solid, plus 15% for each enemy target on the way to its final target. Now, they added this max clause of 275 a few weeks ago on PTR. It's basically damage capped, not target capped, but damage capped. However, the vast majority of the time, or even when it comes to just single target settings, and if you're mixing in single target and AoE, you really don't encounter a whole lot of these mass cleave scenarios. Let's be honest here, we've really only seen Venthyr played in one setting. That's like Destruction, heavy AoE, and Mythic Plus, like in the huge wings of DOS, like in the Chicken Wing, when you pull the chickens at once, or in Halls of Atonement, when you pull the whole dungeon at once, or in Necrotic Wake, when you pull the whole room and the boss at once. You don't see it in like a Spires or a Theater of Pain, or any kind of like, oh, we're just playing this because it's good instance. You're playing it in like a degenerate kind of setting, which is fine, but when it comes to like single target implications and raiding, and not really being able to get like this kind of insane value, albeit now also being capped, Venthyr really falls off by a lot. Now, Venthyr Soulbind is something on their own too. They have some positives and negatives. I think a good step, like, and now that they're sort of getting into like some legendary tuning and like, I guess, conduit, covenant tuning, whatever, I wouldn't mind like a baseline buff to impending catastrophe's damage on its own, because you're stuck playing this thing too if you're playing Venthyr for whatever reason. There is a conduit that buffs IC's damage as well in single target. It does not work in AoE, but I really wouldn't mind seeing some kind of like single target or like some kind of clause added onto this where like it does more damage if it hits like less than 4 targets, or maybe like something like Soul Rot where it has like twice the amount of damage if you hit one target with it. Because like pound for pound, even comparing this to Soul Rat, the damage without like, you know, the conduit is relatively mediocre. You know, that's before factoring in like Dreamweaver Field of Blossoms value, Soulbind value, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty lackluster, relatively mediocre, even being on the actual same cooldown. I'd love Venthyr to be competitive for Warlock, but like it's just really far behind in basically every setting. They could buff like the baseline damage Legendary does, once again, make it like 200%, 300% baseline. But then you're getting into that territory again of like having to cap it on targets, not just the actual maximum damage, and it causes issues. So I think like a great way to actually address the Venthyr issue would legitimately be to add like, hey, this does 200% damage, 300% damage, which could scale off the Legendary if it hits one target and not, you know, multiples. It's sort of like the Soul Rot treatment, but it worked out relatively well for Soul Rot. It does a decent bit of our damage, and also gives like, you know, relevant stacking abilities with soul binds and legendaries and all that kind of stuff, right? When it comes to Kyrian, Scouring Tithe is a bit interesting. They did add a clause to the actual legendary in 9.1, which is, it's the second part of this. If Scouring Tithe expires, you gain 33% movement speed and 15% crit for, I think, 8 seconds, right? If you read the first part of it, that's basically a third of the value of that. Now, previously, before that change, it was just when Scouring Tithe generates soul shards, which means the target has to die to get this legendary effect. Otherwise, it's completely dead. And the legendary does nothing at all, right? And there are times like patchwork fights where you actually get, you know, a long period of the fight where nothing dies. When it comes to certain fights, though, there is like the potential to Havoc Scouring Tithe. You can put Havoc on a mob here, cast Scouring Tithe. If this mob dies, I'll get my 5 shards back from Scouring Tithe. And if this mob doesn't, I'll also get the reset clause on it, which sort of double dips. So there's like some scaling potential, like some higher end, like, I don't know, maybe like degeneracy kind of things with Scouring Tithe and with Languishing Soul Detritus. But, and for the most part, going through the Sims, like, Kyrian's not that far behind. Okay, AF might not be the best look because Neferlord's insane. But looking at, like, Destro, 10, 10.1, 10.2. You've got, you know, basically 11K. It's a bit more behind for Demonology, but it's nowhere near, like, the Venthyr garbage we have here. So, a baseline buff to, like, maybe Scouring Tithe in general wouldn't be that bad. It does have like scaling potential in AoE, like with, you know, shard sniping and weird shard play. But it's sort of hard to place what you really want to do with Kyrian. Because like a flat damage buff would be okay. They could just increase like the actual value you get from Scouring Tithe, like resetting and being able to cast it again on this legendary. That would probably be fine because you're stuck playing Kyrian to give it a bit of a damage increase. But Kyrian's sort of in a weird spot because like it's one of those weird set it and forget it covenants. It just has a bit of like, I don't know, some potential like degeneracy, but it's not like, hey, my soul rot value every minute with my tyrant, or like, hey, my insane Necrolord affliction scaling and execute. It's just there. You just sort of hit it and you just sort of forget it, right? You know, there's not really any kind of like barring a Havoc Cleave scenario, any kind of like weird degen stuff you can do, you know. So for the most part, like heading into 9.2, Night Fae, I think personally is the covenant we're going to play in basically every setting. There could be a couple fights in the raid if you really need this huge execute profile where you play Necrolord Affliction, but like I said, AF is so undertuned in the first place right now, dude. I mean, the huge best build of Necrolord Malefic Wrath stuff is still doing 600 DPS less than the baseline Night Fae Demonology build. There's an issue there, right? Classes that just do more damage will still do more damage in that execute window, which is pretty wild. So, I mean, that's a tuning issue for the actual spec itself. We'll see where it goes, but like, I think Venthyr and Kyrian probably need the most attention when it comes to 9.2 if they want the covenants to be balanced. Now, at this point, I mean, it's probably going to be pretty hard to pull us out of playing Night Fae due to like the AoE scaling and things like that. And even if you're on a single target fight, you can just sort of queue up Necrolord stuff. We have what, like a 30 DPS disparity here, 20 DPS, and you know, it's better for Affliction depending on what you're doing. So it's a bit awkward. Warlock Legendaries as a whole, though, getting back to like one of the other driving points of this video, when it comes to having 2 Legendaries, you actually don't really gain a crazy amount of value. In niche settings, you might, like on Prototype Pantheon, but I'm not gaining, barring one spec of one Covenant and all that stuff, I'm not gaining, you know, 7%, 8%, like a lot of other classes are. Being real, like, Lock is probably better. As sad as this is, Lock is, maybe probably, Lock is going to be better the first 5 weeks of the patch before we get Double Legendaries. Because when we do, other classes are probably going to leave us behind. Oh, and I also forgot to add a bit, when it comes to the Night Fae Legendary, we are using Night Fae once again as like a reference point for being, I guess, the best overall covenant for Warlock. But I wouldn't mind seeing some kind of like single target clause added to this. Maybe like similar to what Soul Rot does, where it doubles the effect if you're hitting only one target. Maybe you get like a 10% crit chance or a crit strike increase and a 10% haste increase if you only hit one target for 8 seconds. It would sort of be cool, thematic. It fits Soul Rot pretty well with the King Soul Satchel being that way. Because like I said, when it comes to like the actual single target sims with Night Fae, yeah, it's still a good covenant. The soul binds are still good, right? But the actual like raw increase is like 3%. 3.1%. What is this? 2.93%. It doesn't feel like, it just feels sort of subpar when I'm putting on this huge, you know, second legendary. It's so awesome and epic in the new patch, and I gain 200 DPS, right? That change might not be enough. I'm not really sure, but I think legendaries like that should probably be looked at and potentially addressed heading into, I guess, the final couple builds of 9.2. But for the most part, I think that Venthyr, Kyrian, Venthyr and then Kyrian, those two need the most addressing, or the most help, because like Venthyr's been subpar for basically the entire expansion for Warlock. It's been the worst covenant, barring being good in the mass AoE destro pulls we've seen for the past few weeks or months, and they nerfed it, right? In the end, I'd like to play Venthyr. It'd be great, but like I said, once again, when it's doing 9.2k and Necrolord's doing 11.3k, there are some issues there, and there's some tuning that probably needs to be done. So hopefully some of this stuff, legendary wise, covenant ability wise, maybe even soulbind wise, is addressed in the final couple builds of 9.2 PTR before we get into the actual patch. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Now, I don't want this video to be seen as like, oh, I'm complaining Lock needs a crazy amount of buffs or anything. I do think Destro and Af could use some buffs, legitimately. They probably should revert the Rapture nerf they did in 9.1 with the other nerfs they put in. Destro can probably use some Chaos Bolt buffs, as well as like Havoc transfer windows, something like that. But the bigger point of this video is like, number one, like Venthyr and Kyrian have been underperforming for a while, and this is the final patch, which like I don't want them to buff a covenant. It's like, you know, bad to being the best covenant just because, hey, it's been terrible. But when there's a 2k difference or more between like just covenants with the same conduits and, you know, semi-similar soul binds in the exact same gearing, barring legendary and barring the covenant ability, there's probably a bit of an issue that needs to be addressed there. So I'm hoping that they can find some kind of middle ground with Venthyr. Maybe look at Kyrian a little bit and try and bring them up to like Necrolord and or Night Fae level of play. On top of that, if they're going to do some legendary tuning, I wouldn't mind them actually looking at like all the legendaries across the board. When it comes to like Night Fae, Necrolord, Kyrian, Venthyr, I don't really know how they're going to do it. I think a good way to actually make, like I said, the Night Fae legendary better in single target, because it's pretty lacking, would be to actually make it like potentially give you double the effect, similar to what Soul Rot does if you're hitting one mob, right? Because it has that 4 target like scaling clause. Maybe instead of like 5% haste and 5% crit, it gives you 10% haste and 10% hit, or crit, I'm sorry. That wouldn't be too bad. I think there's like a solid middle ground you can find there, because one target is like the worst scenario you can really use decaying Soul Satchel in. And when week 5 rolls around, Lock is probably going to get nerfed a bit in an odd way just because of our double legendary combinations being so bad compared to some other specs in the actual raid. But let me know what you guys think of this video in the comment section down below. Any questions, drop them down there as well. I'll be sure to get back to you. I'm curious to hear y'all's take on it. I know there's been a lot of like Venthyr locks and Kyrian, well, I guess there's probably some Kyrian locks out there that have wanted to actually, you know, play those covenants on a higher level, a higher scale for a long time. And hey, you know, I'm right there with you. I wouldn't mind playing some Venthyr stuff, even though I haven't done the Soulbind quest. I guess because I don't really need to, because it's so bad. Yeah, any weak auras or add-ons, profiles you see here, once again, all for free on my Twitch. If you want to swing by, hang out, and grab them anytime, feel free to do so. And I also want to give one big shout out to my patrons again. Thank you guys one more time for all the support. The 9.2 Warlock spreadsheet, once again, is indeed now live. The tier 3 Fell Guard rank from a Patreon or higher does indeed get early access to that. If you're looking at supporting, there should be a link somewhere up here, as well as down in the video description. With that being said, thanks for watching, guys. Be sure to smash the like and sub buttons while you're here. Helps out a ton. And I will catch you all again soon on stream. Peace.